Alright, so welcome back. This week we're talking about music as a complex cultural text. So this lecture will mainly focus on music and methods, while also giving a bit of a closer look to Ava Meyer's article, Vargas's chapter, and De Leon's article. So, we're only going to have 2 lectures this week because I've left you some very heavy and large questions on the discussion board. So before going to more closer readings, I just want to bring up the 2 readings that will be focused on in depth in the next lecture. The article by Perez Torres on postmodern Chicano music, we can see in terms of its methodology that there's this close attention to lyrics, right? This article has large quotations from the songs themselves as a kind of poetry, so you give it like a literary analysis. With Carol's piece on Margaret Cho and Shimabukuro, we see this close analysis of sounds and tones, right? Because if we're talking about music, we're not just talking about the lyrics themselves, we're not just quoting text, we're also thinking about sound, which requires a certain knowledgeability of what music is and how it works. We also see that Carol's article focuses on the place of performance itself as having significant cultural implications. Especially when you think about your favorite band or artist, different things happen at the place of performance than happen if you're just listening to the album. It's a functionally different experience that is nonetheless culturally significant if we're treating music in all of its complexity. And what we can see through this attention to the lyrics, performance, and sounds of music is this relationship between the production, what gets produced and put into the text, and how it relates to these very specific representations through it, and how that maps onto our real world identity. Identity both in terms of the individual identities that it creates, as well as the individual understandings of this larger real world that we live in. So if we look at Ava Meyer's piece on US Latinas and Latinos in Garage Rock, he argues that he takes a genealogical approach. So I want to focus on this term genealogy, which first appears on page 557. If we're talking about a genealogy, we're talking about an alternate timeline filled with gaps and holes as a way of supplementing history proper, right? Because you'll recall that there's a difference between history and the past. The past is the grand field of everything that's happened, whereas history is the ways in which it gets narrated. Not everything from the past ends up in history, even though many things that happen in the past are culturally significant. And as we can see in Ava Meyer's exploration of Garage Rock and US rock, there are very significant holes when it comes to race. We understand it as this UK to the US phenomenon. We understand it as the interrelationship between Black subcultural expression and the way that it gets picked up by white-controlled industries. But we, as Ava Meyer argues, in these narratives, in these histories, we lose the place of US Latinas and Latinos and the very significant contributions that have been made. So what this article represents is a history of a genre through this genealogical approach, which is not about US Latinas and Latinos in the background or in a subculture, but very much how US Latinas and Latinos have contributed to this mainstream popular culture. So now we're no longer talking about individual communities and identities, we're very much talking about how different people and different populations contribute to this genre in ways that get written over and erased. In terms of methods, Ava Meyer pays special attention to album liners and as well as to interviews. So we can understand a significant part of investigating music as these micro-level discourses, right? These little exchanges around these conversations, or even these slightly larger conversations about what it means to both be racialized but also participate in rock. Ava Meyer pays attention to the role of audiences as one way of talking about music, of specific sounds and instrumentations, right? The different types of instruments that speak of distinct Afro-Cuban beats as a way of talking about music in terms of Latinidad. We also see influence as a way of talking about music. If we're looking at influence, we're not just talking about individual US Latinas and Latinos, we're talking about this deep cultural impact that some of them have made. For example, the discussion around Ricky Valens. We can also think about membership in a band as doing something interesting in terms of racial formation. With Albert Meyer's article, we see this in his many discussions about the invisible Latinas and Latinos in these very as culturally significant bands. We can also think about it in terms of Asian Americans, James Iha with the Smashing Pumpkins. Because in an industry where so much gets erased or displaced, we can think of it as doing something on the macro level politically interesting, that people of all different races participate in this in very unequal and very complicated ways. So moving on, the article by Vargas on the Selena. What we see here in this discussion of Tejano culture is this negotiation of multiple cultures. And let's keep in mind that Tejano is not necessarily recognized as a distinct culture outside of its food and its music. So here we can understand culture as marked by its place, right? Tejano very much is Texas. What Vargas brings in terms of methods is a focus on material culture, in terms of stylized self-representation, and also a dance performance, the performance itself, as something that speaks to a certain kind of cultural significance along the lines of production, consumption, and representation. I also want to draw our attention to page 121. Vargas has a discussion about translocation, right? Moving. And I want to point our attention to the fact that cultural translation works the other way as well. Throughout this course, many of you have talked about cultural translation in terms of these texts, objects, and practices from other places becoming a part of US culture. But here with the example of Selena, we see how her music represents an example of how translocation works the other way. How Tejano culture then became exported to places like Puerto Rico and other places that we identify with Latin America and South America. Also, Vargas, just like De Leon on pages 204 and 205, talks about the relationship between music and community. So, I want to think very carefully about music and what it does, not as an abstract, kind of floaty, ethereal discourse, but as a very real set of text, objects, and practices. Because we can see that there's real cultural work that takes place through linking disparate communities, identities, and traditions, but we can also see how this very easily spirals out of control in terms of the way that we talk about it. So, with the example of Selena, we see that there is very real distinct cultural work in defining Tejano culture as a third space. However, let's not get abstract and say that music magically brings people together, because it doesn't. If you look at the specific cultural history of music, it's laden with racism, sexism, xenophobia, heteronormativity, class distinctions, nationalized distinctions. But we can see how it can be this very interesting bridging text. And finally, the last article we're going to talk about in this lecture is De Leon's piece on Filipino Americans, DJ and hip-hop subcultures, and youth gangs. So whereas with Vargas, we see the negotiation of multiple cultures in terms of places, with De Leon, we see the negotiation of multiple subcultures. Culture here marked by its practices, right? On the one hand, we have hip-hop culture, and on the other hand, we have this youth gang activity that is hazardous, but at the same time, kind of community distinct, if we're talking about, in De Leon's way, about very specific demographic communities. So don't essentialize hip-hop with gang activity, but in this case, by looking very closely at what actually happens, not just this macro level discourse, we see that some very interesting things happen when we think about these multiple subcultures together. So gangs are not uniquely Filipino-American, but we do see that by focusing on this ethnic group and its history, we see a differential history to this particular form, right? We see the flashpoint in the 1920s, we see this flashpoint in the 1970s, and we see how within this particular reading, gang youth subcultures are very interestingly linked to music and identity construction. For example, De Leon's argument on page 195. Methodologically, something interesting that happens in this work is a deep inclusion of interviews, both by the author and that happen in other spaces. All right, so I'm out of time, so